So when it comes to grading students, how are schools getting it right, and where are they going wrong?
Oh man, we have enough time for several hours, right? Ah, where they're getting it right is where they're choosing to be evidentiary. They're choosing to make the grade an accurate report of evidence of proficiency regarding a standard or learning target, whatever it is, an outcome, whatever it is. Where they're getting it wrong is they're allowing other factors to impugn the integrity, to distort the accuracy. And they're not seeing it as a form of lying, of distorting the truth.
Okay.
And that's really hard to grasp because nobody wants to be called a liar.
Right.
But I find when you get it to that point and you point out, look, if you seriously are adding something in that buffers a grade higher or lower, and it's a false representation of their learning at journey's end,
Right.
you're literally lying.
Right.
Do you feel comfortable lying to people? And say, well, my hands are tied. Well, that's giving into that.
Right.
So what can you do to kind of begin to change things? Can you weight columns differently? Whatever it is. But a lot of people have no training in grading. It's not you get a stats class, educational measurements class, but how do I design quizzes and tests?
Which you try to survive that, right?
I know, right. I know R-score and T-score, and I know standard deviations, but tell me how to set up my grade book so it's an accurate reflection of what kids are learning, not just what they're doing and things like that. So a lot of people, there's a huge problem with conflation. They're getting that part wrong. They're conflating the report of this with the report of that, and they're not really discerning or disaggregating it. Another place they get it wrong is they do an aggregate mashup of everything and assumes that's accurate and helpful.
This is your overall final.
Yeah,
the final
of a whole year in physics, it's an 86. It doesn't help. So the idea of disaggregation, less curriculum reported per symbol is huge. And the idea that your assessments are revealing story, revelatory. So if I disaggregate, I can see, well, you're strong in this, weak in that, and rather than just pave it all over with one 73%.
Right.
I actually see what's going on. And then I can inform my next steps in instructional design, document progress, provide feedback, the three big reasons why people would want to try to grade and be legitimate. So the idea that grades are communication is epic. It is pivotal.
I love this.
But it's not compensation.
Right.
And so many teachers who have no background in how the students learn discipline and motivation, they see grades as a reward system or as transactional. And that ruins or undermines almost everything we know that is effective in grading. So at some point, you're going to have to make a decision. I think grades should be about accurate communication and integrity and about building students' talents and skills, the whole assessment grading journey. Or I think grades are about sorting children into different categories. They will fundamentally change the way you interact with kids, the way you design lessons, the way you do feedback. Everything's changed. Right. And what's really interesting is that your philosophy about grading reveals your most accurate teacher colors in terms of your philosophy. Like I can know who you are as a teacher and your instruction and lessons and your work with parents by looking at your grading policies way more than almost any other factor in the class, which is why the nerves are very thin. They're close to the skin. In other words, people get so upset over grading because it's really talking about your core values, what you believe as a teacher, and they feel attacked for it. It's not just like, well, how do you do posters in your room, or how do you do your graphics on Google Docs? It is really the fundamental of who I am.
And this is where I think educators can feel like they're being forced to serve two masters, because on one hand, everything that you're espousing here makes all the sense in the world, but on the other hand, I'm from New York State, so we had this APPR push, which you're probably familiar with, which is like we're going to now not only judge students based on the grades that they receive, but we're going to judge teachers based on the grades that their students receive. So, but yet at the same time, we want them to focus on SEL. We want them to about.
Maybe we haven't spent time trying to get your grades accurate and have integrity, teacher to teacher to teacher.
Exactly right.
So why should I go work in a school where grades are going to be depressed for some reason because the students are struggling?
Correct.
And it would make
or they don't have the quote unquote the resources.
And they're the resources, the family parent support.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right. So now they have to serve. They're in this really unfortunate position where they have to serve two masters. It's understandable when you're in that spot. Like, what are you to do? Right. You will ultimately side with the person who is handing you the paycheck, because there's a real life element here. Teachers aren't so well paid that they can afford to just take a few years off until they find the school of their dreams. Very often for a teacher, especially with the way that salaries are structured, once an educator reaches maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 years in, they become almost unhireable in another district because that district is going to have to start them, presumably, at whatever that step is, and they can go ahead and get someone right out of school for thousands of dollars less.
That is really interesting you bring that up, because just yesterday I was going through the research with somebody, and so many principals, so many districts are so desperate. They are now honoring the years in another county in their county, and they will pay at that level because they just can't find enough bodies.
Right. So
that's a little different.
Shortage of teachers in order to open that up to change. Right. They weren't doing that 30 years ago.
I know. But what you're describing is politics, not pedagogy. Right. As long as teachers can be mindful of that. And I think that's kind of the job of the principal, to run interference, to let the teachers do their jobs and say, look, you do what leads to the greatest success. And simply the truth is, how are they going to do well on a standardized test if they're going to help use that as a metric if they know the stuff? So would it be better that you just push ahead, or you don't do this thing that you know is wonderful with SEL or whatever it might be, because then the kid won't learn down the road. Do the stuff that's wise and effective, and the test scores will help. But if you're going to compare me to my grades, well, then I'm going to start fudging the grades because that's about my salary.
Which is exactly what's happened in Atlanta, and there are so
many.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Or Houston and other places.
Exactly.
So I would say you have to decide what you're about as an individual teacher, and you want to hire people who share that conviction. That they're going to try to, on the majority of the time, they're going to try to do right. But if you occasionally slip and your scruples crumble slightly here and there, you're normal. You sleep guilt-free at night, but never, ever shall it jeopardize a student's learning and future. It might be the only thing here, but it always come down to, well, I've had this conversation several times with people in my career where I was espousing a very effective modern pedagogical thing, but they were saying, what about this? And I just had to say, look, you and I don't agree on this particular grading thing, differentiation thing, whatever. The curriculum thing, whatever it was. If it ever comes down to keeping the political peace with you and the friendship, the collegiality with you, and a student's learning and future, you need to know you will lose. Every time I would choose a student over you. I need you to know where I stand at all the turns. So one of the things I learned from John Safier, who talks about the skillful teacher and core values and things, wonderful, wonderful researcher and author, is he made me realize that your core values are those things that cause the most violent reaction in you when they're violated. And they're the very first thing you reference when you have to make a difficult decision. So asking a teacher or principal, what are your core values? What are the lines you would draw in the sand? Is hardly ever done unless you have to defend maybe a dissertation. Or something. You hardly ever have to publicly say, this is what I do and believe. Now critique me. I dare you. And then have to justify and explain it to others. You just do it because the system does it, or it's always been done, or whatever.
Or nobody cares what your opinion
is. Nobody cares what
your values are. Just go ahead and do this. You're a cog in the machine.
Well, the lack of parent complaint is not any way to evaluate a teacher, as well. And a lot of teachers are like, well, I must be okay as a teacher because nobody's complaining. No, they don't care enough about you to complain, to critique, and that's a problem. So I love having teachers sit down and say, what are your core values, the things which you believe just so deeply, and they would cause the strongest reaction if you are forced to violate it. But they're the first thing you always reference. And a lot of teachers say, well, it's always the children. The children come first, which is a Hallmark card, syrupy, sweet sentiment. Except if it really is and you're not a hypocrite, what does that really mean? And that's where the rubber hits the road and people get uncomfortable. Because if kids are really first, you would put yourself in jeopardy if you were trying to argue for something that was good for kids, but politically unkind or unsound or not expedient for you in that moment. And that's where we need the courageous people to step forward.
It's so funny that you say that, because I'll go public with my critique here about there's this huge movement about find your why. Your why. And,
Simon Sinek.
And I love Simon Sinek, but okay, but the answer in education is always the kids, right? I mean, is there something else that I'm missing? So what about the how? Right.
So
that's where the rubber meets the road.
It does, but I don't expand my repertoire, then I'm threatened by every demand you make of me. Because I only have a very limited repertoire. All I have is a hammer. Everything looks like a nail, right?
Yes.
And so I get really defensive. I make excuses. about also I whine about stuff if I don't feel like I have the skills to do the thing you want me to do.
Oh my God.
One of the things that Rick Lavoie talks about, he talks about students with learning disabilities,
Mm-hmm.
is he says motivation is doing to the best of your ability those things you are already capable of doing, not doing new stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So one of my biggest pushes in the classroom is I have to convince you of your own capabilities, because
Yes.
sometimes you don't even believe you have
That's
them.
right.
So if you believe you have the perception to do it, you're like, bring it on. That project's not too bad. I can totally do this.
Right.
But if you perceive you don't have the skill set, this is a huge mountain to climb, and I want to push back and find some way to get out of it.
That's
It's
right.
the exact same thing with teachers. If I come to you and say, oh, it's your turn in the rotation to do the school newspaper
Mm-hmm.
or school literary magazine, and you have the skill set, you're fine, you're good.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, if you don't have that and it's going to be a learning curve,
Mm-hmm.
I will do 4 times the bus duty. I'll be the parent-teacher liaison. I'll do summer school
Right.
if you
I'll
don't make me
cafeteria
do
duty, right.
if you do the literary magazine. And it really is a perception. Do you perceive you have the skills? Then you go for it, which comes back to self-determination theory.
Mm-hmm.
DC and Ryan, researchers, and Dan Pink, in his book
Mhm.
Drive,
Love that book.
talks about the autonomy and the mastery and the sense of purpose.
Mhm.
And one of those is, do I perceive I have the skills to do the thing? Then I'm way more likely to engage and put my heart into it rather than try to subvert it or sabotage it.
Right. And everything you're saying, though, is driven by intrinsic motivation, right?
Yeah,
But yet
yeah.
grading, the way we design it, is
It's
completely
extrinsic.
extrinsic.
Well, isn't that what we talked about a little bit here at the conference, was this idea of the overdependence on the need for external validation. Otherwise, I don't know who I am.
Mm.
I only have value in relation to my test scores. I only have value to what my teacher says,
Mhm.
as opposed to I am an agent of my own learning.
Mhm.
I can tell whether or not I'm doing okay in the class. I don't need somebody else. But a lot of teachers teach to make the kids more dependent on them for affirmation validation.
Mm.
And the affirmation validation should come from the child. I use this in another class. Oh, that's very validating for what I learned in the other class. Oh, I use this to pursue something after school. Now I find value in that.
Mm.
I have professionals in the field giving feedback on the thing I did in your class. And the teacher sets that up to make sure
Right.
that happens.
Right.
Oh, that architect, looked at my bridge or whatever
Right,
it was.
right.
That's validating. I find joy in this thing just for its own sake. I
That's right.
love that's validation. A minority of the time, the teacher should be validating. The validation should come from the student, the student's
Mhm.
experience in life.
Mhm.
But what we have now is the majority of any kind of validation, legitimacy, is just what an adult might stamp on the kid, so to speak, or on their
Mhm.
work.
Mhm.
And that's no way to build that maturity, that agency.
Right, right.
And then they make more and more excuses. They develop the learned helplessness, and you
Right.
get more frustrated.
You use the phrase, the most recent evidence is the most
Yeah.
accurate in your presentation this
Yeah.
morning. Could you just share that with the listeners?
This idea that the most recent evidence is the most accurate actually comes from a tremendous amount of research. Again, Tom Guskey, Susan Brookhart, Ann Davies, Jay McTighe, Grant Wiggins, Ken O'Connor. I mean, there are lots of other folks who are involved in all of this.
Mhm.
And we've come out over and over again. If you include earlier work in the current statement of where they are in their proficiency, it falsifies that report, higher or lower, depending what it is.
Mhm.
And if you look at the logic of, I want a grade to be accurate, if I include this, well, it makes this go down, this endpoint report go down, or goes higher falsely. You've really got to decide, is it an accurate representation?
Mhm.
And so a lot of people were doing things like, well, you got an A in October, and they never assessed it again.
Mhm.
End of the year, we just averaged that A in
Mhm.
from the first quarter or whenever it happens to be. But we never went back and double checked that you carried it forward. And what was happening, this has certainly happened in California the past few years when we've talked about half of all high school students have to retake high school courses in college,
That's right.
is the teachers never went back and double checked that they carried it forward. They just gave the A and let it sit. And we're talking about real learning that moves into long-term memory, not just you're playing the system. I cram it in, I get an A in the test, and I forget it.
Mhm.
Well, what do you aspire to as an educator? They do carry it forward. So from a common sense, logical element, so I guess anecdotally, we found it. And then we literally have the research from the researchers saying, and Tom and Susan just did their wonderful book, 100 Years of Research in Grading.
Oh,
Grading, what do we know
Okay.
and what do we not know
Okay.
about it? So it's a really good book, came out like 2 years ago. At any rate, we see that if you look at effect sizes and meta-analyses
Mhm.
and on and on and on, the recent evidence was actually the most accurate indicator. And then you had the question, do I claim to be accurate?
Right, right.
And if you claim to be accurate, then you have to emphasize this. At least count it more. So some people did like decaying average
Mhm.
and things like that. Or they simply didn't count earlier work if they had really ample robust evidence at the end or whatever it was. Or they just said, okay, well, average that smaller and this one larger, whatever it was. And it makes a ton of sense when you look at the professional world and certification as well. Your years in college, 2-year, 4-year, whatever, to study to be a nurse or whatever it was, is great. But it's your certification exam to get licensure where it really matters. We don't take how you're studying as a freshman and weave it in,
bio,
and weave that into your licensure exam for X, Y, or Z. And so people went, oh yeah. It was like a wake-up call. Yeah. And that really, that was it liberated a lot of people to be able to do some really powerful things with grades that created hope. But in the hope was far more demanding that, by golly, you will learn it.
Right.
And that's one of the frustrations with a lot of the grading ideas is that the kids who knew the rules, able to buffer their grades with things not indicative, all the kind of stuff, are now like, I mean, we're used to getting A's, but now we're getting B's. And the parents get mad. And then they realize after about a year, it takes about a year, oh, there's new rules. We actually have to learn it. We have to carry it forward. I will now do it. And they come right back and they get the rules.
Right.
But I have had parents say, my daughter always got an A, a 4.0. If you do this other stuff and other kids are successful and they learn it, how can my daughter compete? And I've had to say, do you know how that comes across? Your daughter can only shine at the diminishment of others.
Right.
And our whole mission is that everybody learns and everybody can grow and shine. Right. So it's not a zero-sum game. Your daughter will have to distinguish herself another way if there's more competition for fewer spots or whatever it is. But we are not going to have your daughter shine by making sure we limit somebody else.
Isn't that just a paradigm shift of globalization that you just described?
Oh, yeah, right? Exactly. Right? Let's get Jared Diamond in on this so we can really kind of see this with steel and everything else.
That's right.
But it is a concern that, again, parents are operating from anxiety and fear, not knowledge, and not trust in the larger system.
Right.
And so,
because their most precious belonging is in someone else's
totally
hands,
understandable,
which is anxiety-inducing, to say the least.
Yes, but when I say, as a coach would do, when you say that, it comes across like this: is that what you intended? Well, no. Okay, good. Then how would you like to rephrase that to really get across what you'd like to say? But sometimes it is a very base fear. Yeah, it is what I'm feeling. I'm sorry.
Right.
Don't judge me.
Right.
But said, you know what? I'm a parent. I have totally been there. Let's walk together. I'm not going to judge you at all.
Right.
But I'm going to say it comes across like that, and it's probably not how you'd like to conduct yourself. Because I know you better than that kind of thing.
With my doctoral work, just in writing papers and lit reviews and things of that nature, one of the things I did realize, and now it's all coming together when I'm hearing you say, talk about the recent evidence being most accurate, is that the papers that I submitted that had older references were critiqued a lot harder by my professors because they wanted to see me including more recent research. And now with, honestly, my new feeling is like any research that predates COVID and TikTok really needs to be revisited because everything has changed so seismically as a result of these massive shifts that we've undergone. So not to discard or discredit anything that's older than that, but like we have to take a look and see, like, well, are these things still accurate given how much things have drastically changed? It can't be like, well, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? This did happen, and we had never really encountered anything like this in the world of education ever.
Well, there's also that cautionary tale too, and I've written about this, but other people have too. Education is a social science, and usually we can claim and look at patterns and correlations, not causation. And Dylan Williams talks often about having physics envy. It's not a hard science where you can control the exact experiment and get the exact same results because we can't control for context and for variables and how the kid goes, what kind of house he goes home to and how the teacher taught it and whether or not the grades, of course, were accurate or they are consistent with one another, all these myriad of things. Right. So in addition to what you said, which I agree with totally, is this idea of education research can inform what we do, but it can't dictate. And second to that, we don't have robust education research about everything that's wise and wonderful that we do that works for us in the classroom. And so I find it, for some people, cowardly, to say, I must have pure research protocol, double-blind jury, published in a jury journal, proof of this thing that you're advocating for it. Otherwise, I will never do it. And I say, dude, You're trying to be prudent, but it's coming across as cowardly. I don't want to be forced
Right.
to change.
Right. Right.
And so,
And almost dogmatic. Yeah.
Yeah, dogmatic, right? So, can you do local teacher action research? And let's really do it. And to be really honest, we need more research. Would you do that research right now and have a control group, if at all possible? Sometimes the control group, which is not doing the wise and effective strategy, is dishonorable and lacks integrity, unethical. Literally, to have a control group where you don't do the good things for the kids. So people are very loath to kind of get there. So it's a messy world.
Right.
But I think a lot of people, wow, research is so powerful, but it shouldn't be the worship altar, for all things that you do. But you should be attentive to experimenting and saying, let me try this out, but I'm actually going to analyze the data and I'm going to draw conclusions. I'm going to do it as a mini case study rather than just, well, I have an inkling. No, let's do better by our students than that.
Right. So in closing, let me just ask you, what's the next thing that you're thinking of? What's sort of capturing your mind right now? What are you trying to wrap your head around as you kind of leave this conference and move forward into the next chapter?
I am 24/7, every minute of the day, ceaselessly aware of the growing disparity in the haves and have-nots and the isms. So racism, classism, ageism, ableism, all this stuff. And how few times teachers in schools sit down and talk openly and candidly about equity and diversity and all this different stuff, feeling like they're going to say something wrong, or they're going to ignite the political flames and they're going to be ostracized or whatever. When students are craving models of how to have these constructive conversations with civil discourse, and we are getting more and more divisive and toxic in all of that, even amongst adults. And if they don't have good models, then what kind of future generation is going to become eventually the voting citizenry?
That's right.
Right. So my largest push right now, or urgency, I guess, on my horizon, is providing principals and teachers, school board members, communities, the tools of that discourse where we can disagree, but we can come to a common humanity and really do something constructive by way of our students, because it is ripping us apart. And I could have this really cool, wonderful lesson with summarization techniques or whatever, but it dies because of the way you're interacting with the kids, or you're carrying this heavy burden of being ostracized in the faculty lounge because you're Republican or Democrat or whatever it happens to be, whatever it happens to be, Muslim phobia, homophobia, transgender, all this stuff. You believe so strongly about the transgender's child's need to use that bathroom or that bathroom, or not the locker room, or use a locker room. The idea of schools that are allowing religion to sneak in and not keep that separation of church and state is also a part of this. For example, if I'm a football coach in Bremerton, Washington, or someplace,
and or anywhere,
right, and I lead a prayer with my football team, that is in violation, in my mind, of so many different constitutional things. And the Supreme Court got it wrong. And so many times teachers cannot remedy an injustice or realize they're doing an injustice and literally something against the law because they don't know school law. So the idea that you know school law, your rights and responsibilities, and the ACLU can actually help you with this, and the First Amendments is huge. But you are literally indoctrinating those kids who are Jewish and Muslim and so on, and all these things. That kind of, I'm just going to plow ahead because American means being white. America means being a white male. That's the thing. Or this is patriotic, this is not. But having those conversations, we need that more than ever, instead of cowering or saying, I just can't talk about that with anybody, family, let alone friends and colleagues. And if we don't do that, then what kind of students are we going to have, that move into being 18-year-old voters? So I think that's my most urgent thing on that is it kind of speaks to the ethics side, but I think we're an ethical enterprise, and we have an obligation to really consider what is moral, what is in alignment with our values, that sort of thing. So catch me down the road doing that.
Definitely. I think where the disconnect is, at least on the political side of things, is that where we used to look at a particular thing, and I would look at it from, a conservative perspective, and you would look at it from a progressive or a liberal perspective. Now we're not even agreeing that we're seeing the same thing. So our perspectives don't even matter, because we're not even talking about the same concept or the same object.
The Constitution of Knowledge, which came out by I think it's John Rausch.
Okay.
The Constitution of Knowledge is about that very thing, that truth has escaped. The accurate this is a fact, right?
Mm-hmm.
The fake news and all that stuff.
That's right.
I don't know.
Alternative facts,
right? That because that's so now vague, nebulous,
mm-hmm.
and your truth is different than my truth,
That's
we
right.
can't even come together that common ground like you're talking about, and how that's changing literally what we determine is important to know. And so how do I say this really happened in American history? It's challenging and uncomfortable,
Right.
but you say teach history, we have to be accurate.
Right.
We can't do it through this lens. We have to do it through that lens. Well, this is truth and this is not. There are so many great books out there on the collective fugue state that we're putting ourselves in by this, again, echo chamber and just circling in our own insular worlds, that we now can be convinced this is knowledge and this is not knowledge.
Right.
And we can never have those conversations about which you're speaking. You're exactly right.
Right. Because you can't find compromise
Yeah.
if we don't agree that we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah. So that would be a part of my forward movement too, is to help with that, at least in the education world.
Wonderful.
So thank you very much for the time with you.
Well, Rick, you definitely took me to school today, and I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your insights. They were so deep and wonderful, and I'll be revisiting this podcast often, and I'm sure I will come up with new findings every time I come back to it. If you want to find out a little bit more about Rick, we will post all of his links to his website and his resources. You can find that on our website, stateofedpodcast.com. You could also subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or anywhere else you can find podcasts. Pick up a copy of my book, Forward Fast, Making Sense of Education in an Era of Rapid Change, wherever books are sold. You can follow me on Twitter at markisix or markisix.com. Rick, would you like to share any of your socials?
Oh, yeah. Rick Wormeli 2 is my Twitter handle. So don't go to Rick Wormeli 1. I mean, Rick Wormeli, it was hacked. Long story, we don't have time. And then www.rickwormeli.com is the website. So that's easy to get to. And then we'll post the email address too, because I look forward to having that conversation if anybody wants to.
Absolutely. Rick, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.